She had always known that the path she had chosen would be a difficult one. The road to becoming a Navy SEAL was not paved with glory and parades. It was a treacherous climb up a sheer cliff face of physical and mental agony, where one misstep meant a long fall into the abyss of failure. For Maya Alvarez, the climb had been steeper than for most. At 26, she was not just another candidate in the brutally unforgiving basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. She was the first woman in a decade to even make it this far, to stand on the precipice of Hell Week, surrounded by men who saw her not as a teammate, but as an anomaly, a publicity stunt, or, in the eyes of a venomous few, a direct insult to their sacred brotherhood. From day one, the hostility was a tangible presence, a fifth element in the air they breathed. It wasn't in the official training, of course. The instructors, the cold-faced men with eyes like chips of glacier ice, treated everyone with the same impartial, soul-crushing contempt. They didn't care about her gender. They cared about her time on the run, her number of push-ups, her ability to keep her boat crew from capsizing in the frigid Pacific surf. No, the poison came from within her own ranks. It was in the whispered comments that went silent when she turned around, the way her gear was always accidentally knocked into the mud, the absence of a helping hand when she struggled under the weight of an inflatable boat, a help freely given between the other men. The ringleader of this silent persecution was a hulking brute of a man named Brad Coulter. A former college linebacker from Texas, Coulter was built like a concrete bunker and possessed a worldview that was just as immovable. He saw the SEALs as the last bastion of pure, untamed masculinity, a place where the softness of the modern world, which he personified in Maya, should never be allowed to tread. To him, her presence was a desecration. He didn't just want her to quit, he wanted to break her, to watch her spirit shatter under the weight of his contempt. "Come on, Alvarez, pick up the pace," he'd snarl during a run, not as encouragement, but as a public announcement of her perceived weakness. He'd deliberately crowd her during formation drills, his shoulder slamming into hers with enough force to rattle her teeth. His two closest allies, a wiry, rat-faced man named Miller and a silent, hulking giant they called Tiny, were his ever-present enforcers, echoing his sentiments and amplifying his cruelty. Maya, however, was not made of glass. She was the daughter of a Cuban immigrant who had fled Castro's regime with nothing but the clothes on his back and a will of iron. Her father, a carpenter in Miami, had taught her that the only way to survive in a world that wanted to push you down was to build a foundation so strong no one could ever shake it. She had been a state champion wrestler in high school, a sport where she had learned to use an opponent's weight and momentum against them. She had graduated from the University of Florida with a degree in mechanical engineering, a field dominated by men who often underestimated her. Every slight, every condescending comment, every locked door she had to pry open had only sharpened her resolve. The SEALs were just another door, and she had the crowbar. Hell Week arrived not with a bang, but with a soul-sucking, bone-chilling, never-ending scream. It was 5.5 days of constant, methodical torment. They ran until their feet were raw hamburger. They did calisthenics in the freezing sand until their muscles screamed in protest. They paddled inflatable boats through the icy Pacific surf, only to be ordered to dump them out and start again. Sleep was a myth, a distant memory replaced by a fog of exhaustion and the instructor's relentless, bellowing voices. It was during this crucible that Coulter's campaign of hate escalated from petty cruelty to outright sabotage. They were on a night navigation exercise, a sugar cookie run where they had to gallop through the surf, roll in the sand, and then navigate a course by compass. Exhaustion had made everyone clumsy, but Coulter saw an opportunity. As Maya's boat crew struggled to haul their heavy IBS, inflatable boat small, up the beach, Coulter, the assistant patrol leader, deliberately tripped over a guideline, sending himself and 2 other men sprawling. The chaos that ensued was blamed on Maya, who was at the front of the boat. "You're a liability, Alvarez!" Coulter roared, his voice raspy with fatigue and false outrage, loud enough for the roving instructor to hear. You can't keep up! You're a danger to the whole crew! The instructor, a senior chief with a face like a weathered cliff, just stared at her. Get your shit together, Alvarez. You're holding your team back. It was a standard SEAL tactic, to turn the candidates against each other, but in this case, he was pouring gasoline on a fire that was already raging. Maya said nothing. She just gripped the rubber handle of the boat harder, her knuckles white, and pushed on. She knew any protest would be seen as weakness, as making excuses. She just had to endure. The final straw came on the last night of Hell Week. They were in the middle of a long, freezing, and seemingly endless problem. Their mission: to navigate a series of small, rocky islets just offshore. The wind was howling, kicking up a nasty chop, and the cold had seeped into their very bones. Maya was in the water, acting as a surveyor, when she felt a heavy hand on her head, shoving her under the surface. She came up sputtering, gasping for air, to see Coulter laughing, a feral, humorless sound swallowed by the wind. "Oops, lost my footing," he sneered. Miller and Tiny snickered nearby. That was it. The cold, the exhaustion, the pain. None of it compared to the hot, clean rage that suddenly flooded her veins. It wasn't a hot-headed anger, but a cold, precise fury. She didn't scream or curse. She just looked at Coulter, her gaze as steady and unwavering as a sniper's scope. "You're going to regret that," she said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the wind like a knife. Coulter just laughed again. "What are you going to do, Alvarez? Cry to your daddy?" She didn't answer. She just turned and swam back to the boat. The hate in Coulter's eyes had shifted from contempt to something darker, something more dangerous. Her quiet defiance, her refusal to break, had lit a fuse within him. He had to destroy her. It was no longer just about pride, it was an obsession. Miraculously, she made it through Hell Week. She was one of the surviving few, her body broken but her spirit forged into something new. The training continued, moving from the beaches of Coronado to the land navigation phase in the rugged, unforgiving mountains. It was here, away from the main training command, that Coulter saw his chance. The exercise was a solo navigation course. Each candidate was dropped off at a remote location with a map, a compass, and a set of coordinates to find over a desolate 20-mile stretch of chaparral and rock. They were alone, reliant only on their own skills. It was a test of mental fortitude as much as navigation. Maya had been on her course for about 4 hours, picking her way through a dry riverbed when she heard the growl. It was a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the air, primal and terrifying. She froze, her hand instinctively going to the only weapon she had, a heavy-duty Gerber survival knife strapped to her vest. She scanned the terrain and saw them, a pack of 3 dogs. They weren't the friendly, well-fed labs she was used to. These were feral, lean, with matted fur and eyes that glowed with desperate hunger. They were strays, probably abandoned by ranchers who had formed a pack to survive. They were at the bottom of the ravine about 50 yards away, and they had seen her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every SEAL training manual, every survival lesson, screamed one thing: do not run. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct. She had to stand her ground, make herself look big, and slowly, carefully retreat. She began to back away, moving sideways along the ridge, keeping her eyes locked on the alpha, a rangy, scarred animal with one torn ear. She raised her arms, making herself as large as possible. "Hey! Hey!" she yelled, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Back off!" For a moment, it seemed to work. The dogs hesitated, watching her. Then, the alpha lowered its head and took a step forward. The others followed suit. They were going to charge. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension, the crunch of boots on gravel. Maya dared a glance to her left and saw a group of 3 figures emerging from behind a large boulder. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear, now clenched with a different, colder dread. It was Coulter, Miller, and Tiny. They weren't on their navigation courses. They were here, together, and the smug, triumphant grin on Coulter's face told her everything she needed to know. They had followed her. They had waited for this. "Well, well, well," Coulter drawled, his voice slow and mocking. "Looks like the little frogman found herself a real problem." He gestured with his chin towards the dogs, who were now distracted by the new arrivals, their attention wavering between the three men and the lone woman. Maya kept her eyes on the dogs, but her peripheral vision was locked on the men. "This isn't the time, Coulter," she said, her voice tight. "We need to work together. Loud noises, group up, we can scare them off." Coulter let out a short, ugly laugh. "Work with you? Nah, I don't think so." He took a step closer to her, not towards the dogs. Miller and Tiny flanked him. "See, Alvarez, I think you need a lesson, a real-world lesson about where you belong." A horrific understanding began to dawn on Maya. The dogs, momentarily confused, were now focusing again, drawn by the tense, aggressive postures of the humans. The Alpha took another step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. "Coulter, don't be a fool," Maya pleaded, her voice dropping. "Those dogs will attack, all of us." "That's the point," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Miller and Tiny. "Now!" In a single, coordinated movement, the three men rushed forward, but not at the dogs. They rushed at Maya. Before she could react, before she could even draw her knife, 4 hands grabbed her. She struggled, her training kicking in, but she was exhausted, and they had surprise and mass on their side. They dragged her, kicking and screaming, not away from the dogs, but towards them. "No! Let me go!" she shrieked, her voice raw with terror and fury. They hauled her past the boulder, down a small embankment, and shoved her with all their might. She tumbled head over heels down the rocky slope, landing in a heap at the bottom of the ravine, not 20 feet from the pack of feral dogs. The world spun, dust filled her mouth, and pain shot through her ankle. She looked up, dazed, to see Coulter's face peering over the edge of the ravine. He wasn't angry anymore. He was smiling. "Time to say farewell, bitch," he yelled down, his voice echoing with savage glee. Then they were gone, their footsteps fading into the desolate landscape, leaving her alone with the dogs. The Alpha stared at her, its lips peeled back, revealing yellowed fangs. A deep, menacing growl vibrated from its chest. The other 2 dogs fanned out, flanking her. Maya's mind, which had been a hurricane of fear and rage, went completely silent. It was the quiet that came before the storm, the clarity of a target in her crosshairs. There was no time for thoughts of Coulter, of revenge, of fairness. There was only now. There was only survival. She slowly, carefully pushed herself up onto her knees, keeping her movements smooth and non-threatening. She met the Alpha's gaze but didn't stare it down. That would be a challenge. She looked slightly to the side, submissive but ready. Her hand, as steady as a surgeon's, moved to the knife on her vest. She unsnapped the strap. The faint snick of the nylon was the only sound. The Alpha took a step closer, then another. It was close enough now that she could smell its rancid breath, see the parasites crawling in its mangy fur. She gripped the handle of the knife. Her father's voice echoed in her mind from a lesson long ago. "Mija, the best way to win a fight is to not be there. But if there is no other way, you don't fight to win. You fight to survive. And when you fight to survive, you don't play fair. You do whatever it takes." She wasn't going to win a straight fight with 3 starving dogs. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. The Alpha coiled its muscles, preparing to lunge. In that split second, Maya Alvarez, the unwanted rookie, the target of hatred, the woman they had tried to break and then feed to the beasts, did the one thing that could save her life. She stopped seeing herself as the prey. As the Alpha launched itself at her, jaws snapping, she didn't flinch. She didn't run. With a speed born of desperation and honed by months of brutal training, she moved into the attack. The world narrowed to a single point of contact. Her left arm shot up, not to push the dog away, but to guide it. She took the brunt of its weight on her forearm, its teeth sinking deep into the thick fabric of her tactical sleeve instead of her throat. The impact knocked her backward, but she used the momentum, rolling onto her back and pulling the dog with her. It was a wrestling move, a reversal. As they tumbled, her right hand, the one with the knife, came up and around in a short, powerful arc. She didn't stab wildly. She found the soft tissue under the jaw, just behind the skull, and drove the blade in with all her strength. The dog yelped, a horrible choked sound, and then went limp. She shoved the heavy carcass off her just as the second dog, a brindled female, lunged. There was no time to recover. Maya scrambled to her feet, the alpha's blood hot on her hands, and faced the remaining two. They hesitated, momentarily shocked by the sudden violent death of their leader. It was the opening she needed. She didn't wait for them to charge. She let out a roar, a primal, terrifying sound that came from somewhere deep in her soul, a sound that held all the fear, the rage, the pain, and the sheer, indomitable will to live that had carried her this far. She charged them. The brindled dog, caught off guard, tried to dodge, but Maya was faster. She slashed at its face, opening a deep gash across its snout. The dog yelped and recoiled, blood spraying. The third dog, a young, less confident male, saw its two packmates, one dead, one wounded and bleeding. Its survival instinct, just as strong as Maya's, kicked in. It turned and fled, scrambling up the far side of the ravine. The brindled female, whining and defeated, quickly followed. Maya stood there in the center of the small battlefield, chest heaving, knife dripping. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had died. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the faint, final twitching of the dead dog at her feet. The adrenaline that had flooded her system began to recede, leaving behind a tsunami of pain. Her ankle was a hot, throbbing ball of fire. Her left forearm, where the alpha had bitten her, was torn and bleeding through her shredded sleeve. Every muscle in her body screamed. But she was alive. She was alive. She looked up at the ridge where Coulter and his cronies had stood just moments before. It was empty. They were gone, probably already miles away, heading back to the extraction point, confident they had finally, permanently erased their problem. They would report that she must have gotten lost, fallen into a ravine, met with some kind of accident. In the brutal, dangerous reality of SEAL training, such things, while tragic, were not unheard of. It would be a closed case. Maya looked down at the dead dog, then at the blood on her hands. A slow, cold smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of a predator who has just realized its own strength. They thought they had thrown her to the wolves. They had no idea they had just created one. The immediate problem was survival. She was alone, miles from anywhere, with a badly injured ankle. She couldn't walk out. But she was a Navy SEAL candidate. Improvise, adapt, overcome. It wasn't just a motto, it was her new reality. She limped to a nearby rock outcropping, finding a small alcove that offered some shelter from the wind. She used her emergency blanket, a small silver sheet of mylar, to wrap herself in. She used strips of her torn sleeve to bind the wound on her arm. It was a deep bite, but it had missed the major arteries. She was lucky. No, she corrected herself, she had made her own luck. She spent the night shivering in her rocky shelter, sipping water from her canteen, her knife clutched in her hand. Every sound was a potential threat. But the remaining dogs did not return. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep over the mountains, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't report this, not yet. If she went to the instructors and accused 3 fellow candidates of attempted murder, with no witnesses but the dogs, it would be her word against theirs. She would be the woman who couldn't handle the pressure, who made up wild accusations to explain her own failure. Her career would be over, and Coulter would have won. No, this was her problem, and she would solve it her way. She had to get back to the extraction point, and she had to do it on her own. She fashioned a crude splint for her ankle from a straight piece of wood and more strips of cloth. Then, she began to crawl. For the next 12 hours, Maya Alvarez crawled, limped, and dragged herself across 10 miles of unforgiving desert. She used the map and compass she had held onto throughout the entire ordeal. She followed dry washes to avoid the steepest terrain. She stopped to rest when the pain became blinding, and then she got up and moved again. The sun beat down, then began to sink. She thought of her father, of his journey from Cuba with nothing. This was her journey now. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, painting the mountains in hues of orange and purple, she saw it. The lights of the temporary camp, the extraction point. She had made it. When she finally crawled into the light of the campfire, the SEAL instructors, men who had seen everything, stared in shock. She was a mess, covered in dirt and dried blood, her face haggard with exhaustion and pain, her ankle grotesquely swollen. But her eyes were clear and sharp. A senior chief, a different one from Hell Week, was the first to reach her. "Alvarez? What the hell happened?" Maya looked up at him. She could have told him everything. She could have pointed the finger, screamed for justice. But that would have been the easy way. That would have been letting someone else fight her battle. She thought of Coulter's smug face as he shoved her into that ravine. He thought she was dead. He thought he had won. The anticipation of seeing his face when he realized she was very much alive was a fuel more powerful than any ration bar. She took a deep, ragged breath. "Sir," she said, her voice a dry croak, "I took a fall. Bad one. Got turned around. Took a while to navigate back." The senior chief's eyes narrowed. He looked at her ankle, at the bite marks on her arm visible beneath the bloody wrappings. "A fall," he repeated, his voice flat. He knew. He might not have known the details, but he knew a lie when he heard one. The bite marks were not from a fall. But he also saw something else in her eyes. He saw a steel that was rarely seen, even in the teams. He saw a woman who had faced something unspeakable and had not only survived, but had returned with her will intact, and a secret locked behind her eyes. He nodded slowly. "Get her to medical," he ordered the men who had gathered. "Now!" As they loaded her onto a stretcher, Maya allowed herself one small, private smile. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. They had tried to kill her. They had failed. And she was going to make sure they paid for it, not with a report, not with an accusation, but by succeeding, by becoming one of them, by becoming a SEAL. And then, she would have all the time in the world to figure out what to do with Brad Coulter. The farewell, she thought as the medics carried her away, was going to be hers to say.